Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Dan Kovalik. He's an American human rights, labor rights lawyer and peace activist. He has contributed articles to CounterPunch, the Huffington Post, and TeleSUR. He teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Today we talk about his new book, Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture. So first off, thank you for your work in the world. And second, thank you for being on the program.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Derrick.
So why don't we just start off with a definition of cancel culture? What does it mean?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I do define it in the book. I think there is a general agreement on what it means. And that is essentially it is a movement, if you want to call it that. I mean, it's a loosely, based. It's not like there's any leaders of this movement or culture, but essentially it's a culture in which people feel free to essentially unite to shame somebody, many times because of something they've said or written about. Sometimes it's because of something they've done. And sometimes that mobbing, again, many times on social media, but not always limited to that, accelerates into people calling for the targeted person to be fired from their job, to lose, their status and reputation. Yeah, I think that's a fair definition of it.
So can you trace a little history either of cancel culture? Okay, I'm going to go a bunch of different directions with this, and you can go whichever one you want. Okay, either your interest in cancel culture or cancel culture from the left or cancel culture in general, because obviously the left is not the only people to cancel. Is not the only group that's ever canceled anybody. So can you either go history of cancel culture on the left, or your interest?
Yeah, I'll do a little bit of the last two, cancel culture from the left, because that's the focus of my book, because I am a leftist. And I obviously the right does canceling, but my message is mostly to progressives who have decided that somehow this tactic, if you want to call it that, of canceling people is a form of activism, which largely I don't think is true. So I will focus on that type of cancel culture and also talk about my interest in it. And I've been, well, why don't I just start there? I've been concerned about it for some time because, like a lot of us who are active on social media, we see people being targeted for cancellation quite often. And that was, a concern of mine, but I was honestly reticent to delve into this subject because, as I quote my son in the book, who said, Dad, the surest way to be canceled is to criticize cancel culture, which of course is true. But then finally, things came to a head last year. I believe it was in May of 2020, when a friend of mine was canceled in a very public fashion and in a very kind of final and severe way. Her name is Molly Rush. She's 85 years old. She is a famous peace activist, has been involved in the peace and justice movement for over 50 years and helped found the Peace and Justice Center in Pittsburgh 50 years ago called the Thomas Merton Center. And last May, she reposted on Facebook a meme that had a picture of Martin Luther King, and it said, "Never rioted, never looted, save the world." And this was done, during the height of the George Floyd protests. And so people reacted very quickly against her on Facebook in particular. Hundreds of posts were directed towards her, criticizing. Not criticizing isn't even the word, because criticism is, okay. In the leftist movement, we talk about self-criticism. I mean, obviously, we have to be, kind of keep each other honest. I don't have a problem with that. But they were very mean-spirited, attacked her family as well, called them white trash. And people called for her to be canceled in the following way, essentially to be told that the people would not work with her anymore in the movement, and in particular that the Merton Center that she helped found 50 years ago would tell her that, would distance themselves from her. And that's exactly what happened. The Thomas Merton Center, the board of the Thomas Merton Center, sent out an open letter that they posted on Facebook and also sent to all the members of the Thomas Merton Center saying that they could no longer work with Molly Rush. And they said it doesn't matter what her intention was of posting the meme. And apparently she just did it very, without a lot of thought, like a lot of us. She saw the meme, liked it, and just hit share, like a lot of us do. And the board said it didn't matter what her intention was, and they didn't say this. They didn't acknowledge that she apologized on Facebook. They still said she needed to apologize in a way they felt was sufficient without mentioning she had already apologized. And by the way, they didn't tell people in the letter what she had posted. So all they said is she posted a racist meme without explaining what that meme was. I mean, it could have been anything, right? Of course, they use the old canard that is used in cancel culture. Well, we can't repeat what she said because that would offend people. Meanwhile, other people trying to cancel her, even though she took down her post with the meme, took screenshots of that post for posterity. So there's a lot of contradictions and hypocrisy in all this. But in any case, they said we can't work with her anymore, and that was it. And this is what spurred me on to come public, in this book. First, I came public on Facebook saying that, look, this is ridiculous. You should not do this to her. This is cruel and counterproductive. And then I decided to write a book about it because, as I said, I had been ruminating about this for some time. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. I just felt like I couldn't be silent because I think in the end, it's people being cajoled into silence that allows this to continue. I think most people don't like this. I think most people who saw what happened to Molly didn't like it. But also most people were afraid to come to her defense because they knew they would be the next target, And so it is kind of not only is it this aggressive cancel culture that's the problem, but it's also a conspiracy of silence where people are afraid to speak out against it. And I decided, well, I'm not going to be one of those people. So.
Well, thank you for speaking out on it. So do you want to talk a little bit about the history of the development of cancel culture on the left?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a fairly new thing, I think it started, from what I can tell, in academia. This is where it is most, what's the word? This is where it's more at an epidemic, level. And it's a fairly new phenomenon, because I was a student activist myself in the late 80s, early 90s, and this was not a thing back then, in part because there was not social media. There wasn't an internet at all, And I do think the internet, the rise of the internet, the rise of social media, things like Facebook, Twitter, certainly are, played a huge role in this being a thing, Though I can't, I don't think one can totally blame that. But what I think happened was the left, this goes back to things that were at least starting to percolate in the late 60s, early 70s with postmodernism, the New Left, which began to turn its back on class issues and class struggle.
Okay, just a sec. I want to just stop here for a second and beg you to push as hard as you want on this particular thing. I've been praying for the last 24 hours, secularly, I guess, that you would bring up postmodernism. So go.
Yeah, well, it was a reaction, and I can't claim to be a philosopher, but I know enough about it. It came from French philosophers, again, who turned on Marxism in a very severe way. Some of it was in response to the Soviet Union and the excesses and repression that they saw in the Soviet Union, in China, and other communist countries, and also some of the more repressive tactics within parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, communist parties, throughout the world, including in France and Great Britain and the United States. And some of the concerns that, race or the class, that there was an overfocus on class, and to the exclusion of being concerned about racial justice issues and gender issues. And those were real things. I mean, I think there were problems in that regard. But what happened was, I think the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, and the postmodernists began to question whether there was even an objective reality. And this may sound like way off topic for cancel culture, but there's no way to really talk about cancel culture without getting into this, because the postmodernists began to elevate people's subjective feelings over objective reality, that's all we have. And so when one does that, of course, it allows everyone to interpret reality, again, assuming there is such a thing. I think there is, but again, assuming there is such a thing, in their own way. And to, if I say I'm offended by something, for example, it doesn't matter whether, objectively speaking, that thing is offensive, right? I mean, we used to have some yard marks for what we considered offensive or hate speech. But now it comes down to whether, individuals just simply feel offended, and that's all that we need to justify cancellation. And again, what the postmodernists and the New Left did was to abandon class struggle, and what that meant is abandoning the working class. And so it became a very intellectual movement, again, in the academy. And when this happened, I think this laid the groundwork for cancel culture as we see it today, where people, first of all, look down on the working class, look down on lesser educated people who tend to be from the working class, because they don't have the privileges of going to school. And that's one of the ironies, of course, because people often talk about privilege in the New Left circles, which is almost everyone who's considered themselves left. But they tend to be the most privileged people you'll ever meet, right? And that's the irony. And they don't, by and large, relate to ordinary working class people, and again have a certain contempt for them. And that is all informed by what was happening with the New Left and the postmodernist movement, again in the late 60s, early 70s, which, by the way, and you can read a lot about this, and I'm going to sound like a conspiracy theory nut, but those movements were supported by the CIA, for example. The CIA saw that this was going to work to their benefit, these ideas, because again, it would mean people would abandon Marxism, they would abandon class struggle, they would abandon supporting the Soviet Union and supporting China, and it worked. I mean, it did work. And so now you have a left in the U.S., if you want to call it that. That, and I quote this at the beginning of my book, you have a left now that does not care a lot about objective reality. They are as willing to engage in magical thinking as the right wing is, you know. And they've abandoned trying to unite with working class and poor people to change the economic landscape of this country. I'm not saying everyone is like that, but I think largely the left, the lion's share, has abandoned all of those efforts. And again, they have substituted for those efforts things like cancel culture, where people like myself and my colleagues in college were protesting against apartheid in South Africa, protesting against Reagan's war in Central America, protesting against the CIA and CIA recruitment on campus because of the CIA's role in coup d'etats and whatnot. Now, student activism doesn't focus on such things. They do see the ganging up on a professor as somehow activism because the professor has done something they deem somehow racist or sexist. And so that has become a form of activism, which has now had bled out into the society as a whole from the academy. And to me, it's not a form of activism that is advancing anything as far as I'm concerned. And one thing, again, how all this relates, and I hope I'm being articulate because there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of interconnected things. But, you know, the interesting thing about that, about the fact that you have this cancel culture, which has increased over time in the academy, what also has happened in the academy at the same time, and by coincidence, by the way, it's not that these two, they've developed on parallel tracks, but they're very important. The other thing that's happened is the adjunctification of the academy. So just as people begin to decide that, hey, our activism is going to be trying to get a professor fired, meanwhile, the universities are giving out tenure less and less and hiring more and more people known as adjuncts. People who may even have a PhD, may have a terminal degree, but they have no tenure. They have no job security. They're hired for a few $1,000s a course to teach what full-time people are teaching and getting paid a lot more to do and having job security for their work. So what happened is not only – so just as cancel culture becomes a phenomenon on the campuses, you also have professors who are very vulnerable to it because now they don't have the tenure to protect them. It's easy to get rid of them. And again, I'm not saying these things – again, they happened independently of each other, but it made the ability to truly cancel someone much more possible. And it also makes the idea that somehow people are engaged in, you know, taking on the man by this, it makes it more silly because what many times you're doing is just kicking down again on these professors who are getting paid poverty wages. They might as well be working at Starbucks. And I'm an adjunct, by the way. I know a lot about this. I teach at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. I teach international human rights. I have a terminal a degree, a doctorate of jurisprudence from Columbia Law School, not a bad school. I was a labor and human rights lawyer for 26 years. I've written my 6th book that was been published. And for all of my experience and effort, I get paid $3,000 to teach a 3-credit course at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. And I'm one of many, many people in that category. And so the idea that these students who tend to be very privileged themselves would go after someone like an adjunct, again, who now are the majority of professors in America, really is, to me, a very concerning thing, and not something that people should feel proud about.
Unfortunately, I think they do. So you took in a breath to respond to that. You certainly can, and I also have a response dump that you can take anywhere you want. So do you want to respond to that first, or do you want me to just to dump out?
Or that they do feel proud about it? Yeah, I mean, they do, because they get a pat on the back. I mean, that is to say, while there are plenty of people who don't agree with this cancel culture, there are plenty of people who do. And so, yes, I mean, students, and the irony is, guess who supports them often? The administration of the university, right? So they unite with the administrators, who, by the way, many get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, to go after these lowly adjuncts. So, I mean, it is really a violation of class solidarity. It's anti-class solidarity. But yeah, they are rewarded for it, and sometimes they get their picture in the New York Times, because everyone likes to write about these stories, and generally the stories are pretty balanced and even-handed. They certainly are not overly critical of people doing this. So, but feel free to give how you feel about it.
I think there is a certain power once they give up on class analysis, which, I mean, as we know, the gap between rich and poor is getting bigger and bigger. The rich are getting richer, and so if you really enter class struggle, you're going to find feelings of great despair, and sometimes feelings of ineffectiveness. And it's so much easier to bash that fascist professor who said something I don't like. There's a feeling of accomplishment. Of course, on the big scale, you've not accomplished something good. But I love this line by Erich Fromm, the psychiatrist. I affect, therefore I am. And, you can feel effective on a small scale. When working on class issues means you have to organize, it's long, hard work that takes generations.
Well, I think what you're saying is absolutely right. And I do discuss that in the book as well. And I cite people like Chris Hedges, who also say this, that essentially this type of politics, if it's any kind of politics, is the politics of despair and of fatalism. It is, as you say, an ability to at least feel like you're doing something, when in fact you feel otherwise powerless to do things that are significant, like stop a war, right? And you see that peace activism is almost dead in the United States. And I think it's because part of it, I think people certainly after 2003, and again, if we have young people who don't remember what happened then, in 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq based on a lie that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And frankly, even if they had them, they would have gotten them from us to begin with. So the whole thing was absurd. But in any case, weapons of mass destruction were never found. And many of us in the peace movement knew they never would be. So the war in any case, but before the invasion, there were some of the biggest peace protests in the world happening. in New York City, in San Francisco, in London. And it was a very exciting time to be an activist, particularly a peace activist. And my wife and I took our little kids at that time in strollers to these places, to New York City, to these big protests, and in Pittsburgh too, where we live. And it was an incredible time. But the war happened anyway. Now, for someone like me, I understand what you're saying, that, okay, we didn't win that battle, but it was worth fighting, and it was a good cause, and I'm glad that we did those things. But for a lot of people, it was disheartening. The idea that we could have millions of people protesting around the world, and we still couldn't stop the war. And I think that this does play into, again, as you say, people's focus on little victories that they feel they can get. Getting a teacher fired, getting a statue taken down, or knocking a statue down. Again, is this going to help anybody? No. But it is something. It is concrete. And I agree with you. This does come out of a certain fatalism that we can change things. And yeah, so I understand it to some extent, but it's not, I don't excuse it, but I certainly understand where it's coming from.
So another part of the problem is, as you were saying about postmodernism, I love this line. I'm not a big fan of the philosopher Daniel Dennett in general, but he has a great line about postmodernism that says, postmodernism, the school of thought that proclaimed there are no truths, only interpretations, has largely played itself out in absurdity, but it has left behind a generation of academics in the humanities disabled by their distrust of the very idea of truth and their disrespect for evidence, settling for, quote, conversations, end quote, in which nobody is wrong, that's not really true, and nothing can be confirmed, only asserted with whatever style you can muster. And my point in bringing up that quote is that, okay, you and I disagree about subject A. It doesn't matter what it is, death penalty or immigration, or it doesn't matter what. You and I disagree. Well, okay, we argue. So I say, look, here are the facts about the death penalty, and you say, well, okay, I agree with you that these facts imply this, but I think these facts imply this. And that's what an argument is. Sorry to be so basic. But if you give up on the notion of objective reality and of truth, then really the only argumentation tactic you can have is, well, Dan, you're a fascist. Well, Dan, shut up. Because if I can't argue you out of the position, then the only thing is for me to either manipulate you or threaten you or somehow get you to stop. Anyway, that's it seems to me an end result of the notion that there are no realities is that you have to cancel the other people.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the left is not willing to engage in its own self-criticism of what you're talking about. The left is often quick to say that the right will not face reality, will not face the reality of climate change, for example, will not face the reality of COVID, for example. And there's a lot of truth to that. The right has their own, if I can call it, religious beliefs about these things. Again, religion being a form of belief that does not need proving, right? And so the left is right to criticize, or the left is correct to criticize the right for engaging in the magical thinking they do on those issues. But the left is not willing to be honest and say that they engage in the same magical thinking. So what are some examples of that magical thinking? Frankly, and I write about this in the book, and I know it's going to be very controversial for me to point this out, but during the demonstrations last summer, You may recall that leading up to the George Floyd demonstrations, liberals and the left were very, very, and continue to be, very self-righteous about the need to socially distance, right? To quarantine, to have lockdowns in order to, combat the coronavirus. And people who were critical of it, particularly, from the right, who said, no, the lockdowns are oppressive and they're killing business. Those people were criticized by the left and sometimes canceled as being granny killers or whatever, right? And they were anti-science because they were saying these things. Then all of a sudden, you have millions of people protesting on the streets in the U.S. And I was at some of those protests, by the way. And I supported the protest. But not only did people protest, but people in the media began to say that, you need to stay locked down unless you're engaged in those protests. And there was also an implication that, by the way, those protests were safe to engage in because they were outside. People were largely masked. But this begs the question, well, what else could we maybe be doing that's masked and outside that allows people to continue working, for example, instead of losing their livelihoods? And these, if you even ask that question, again, you faced potential cancellation. There was a magical thinking. There was this almost religious dispensation for people engaged in the protest. And if people of other political persuasions were rightly offended by this, like, what are you saying, Governor Cuomo, right? You just said we all need to be locked down, and now you're supporting people going into the streets and protesting, sometimes burning buildings, whatever. There was an irrationality to this that, again, the left is unwilling to acknowledge, I think.
This is one of the things that horrifies me about this. I've been comfortable just talking about and describing the right-wing lies since Ronald Reagan, since I became politically aware at all I'm a little bit older than you are. Since I became politically aware in the early 80s. And, I've written books about the right-wing lies. And if I were to rewrite them now, I would have to add chapters about the left lying too and being really hypocritical on this. And so part of my question, something that I think about a lot, and perhaps you're a better historian than I, has the left always lied like this? Or is this a sort of, is it on the ascendancy? Have you thought about this?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, certainly the left, obviously is guilty of its own share of lying. You had, of course, George Orwell being the most famous person to call the left out on that. In books like 1984 and Animal Farm, about particularly the Soviet Union and the communist movement, at times being disingenuous, again, if not outright lying, spray painting or Leon Trotsky out of photos he was in and then different things. So yes, the left, because it's made of humans and humans err and humans lie, has had its own share of lying. But there was always people like in Orwell or others to call out that lying and to say, look, we can't do this, right? This is not us. If you're a leftist, if you don't do anything else as a leftist, you have to confront reality and talk honestly about it. That's what we do. Now, again, have we always lived up to that? No, obviously. What I would say, though, that's different, again, as you say, at least the left acknowledged that there was an objective reality that you could lie about, right? Now there's a question whether there is an objective reality. Now it's about people's feelings that dictate how we feel about things and how we view things. That's how the left now is different than it used to be. And by the way, it gets into this other issue talking about people's feelings, is whose feelings matter, right? That is a huge question. Because, like, for example, after the shooting in Atlanta that happened last week, mostly Asian women were killed. One thing that NPR was talking about is we need to talk about this, and we need to listen to authentic Asian voices about this. Well, what does it mean to be an authentic Asian voice, and who decides that? And that's an interesting question. You had during the George Floyd protests, for example, we have to listen to black voices, which I'm all okay with. I'm all in favor of. But that almost implies that all African Americans think the same, which is not true. I mean, in fact, saying that they do itself is racist, right? So who decides are the authentic voices of a particular race or a particular sex or gender? And who decides? And that's a really bizarre situation. Essentially, the quote authentic unquote voices are those that whoever is talking happens to agree with, right? They're authentic if we think they're right, which really means don't care what they really think. You just want people to agree with you. So, but again, there's very little self-awareness about that, that's happening.
You know, I've never forgotten that I interviewed Christian Parenti many, many years ago. And one of the things that he mentioned was that, and it was about his book that's basically against the police. And one of the things he said, though, is consistently when you interview people who live in very high crime areas, they pretty consistently want actually a higher police presence because the police are not even the most well-organized or well-armed gang that's controlling their lives. And so the point is, again, back to this, which are the authentic voices? The ones who want to defund the police, the ones who want to fund the police more, the ones who just want to get through the day and be able to get on the bus and go to work or drive a car to get to work or do whatever it is they do and get to work. You know, which are the authentic voices? It's a hugely important question. And I agree with you that it all boils down to the authentic voices are the ones I agree with.
And when you don't allow for true debate and you aren't willing to listen to other voices, then what you're doing is silencing particular voices, and that could mean silencing particular African American voices or Asian voices because you don't agree with them. Again, that itself seems racist to me, but that is not acknowledged as such. You know, I write about in the book, you know, in Chicago, in Englewood, there are African American residents trying to keep the BLM protesters out of their town because they didn't want them to. They were trying to build a good relationship with the police in Englewood, and so they didn't want that compromised by the protesters, and they didn't want the protesters coming in and, frankly, destroying businesses. So they literally set up, blockades to keep them out. Well, are those people in Englewood, those African American residents, are they authentic voices? Do we care what they think? And when we talk about defunding the police, no one supports that. No one. The polls show this. The high African Americans as a group support it the most, and they support it at a 33% margin, or 33% of African Americans support it, and it goes very steeply down after that. Meaning the vast majority of people in the U.S., even though the majority of people want police reform, want justice reform, no one supports defunding the police. And yet that was the slogan of last summer. And again, if you criticized it, you could be canceled for that. But the truth was, it was a terrible slogan. Whoever came up with it had no political nuance. or sensitivity, and it was stupid. But you can't say that.
I was just going to say, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, okay, he's canceled again.
Right. It was foolish. And you had, at the time, you had people wanting Medicare for all, and you had a pandemic that begged for Medicare for all, that begged for more stimulus. We got, $1,200 last spring, then another $600 by the end of the year, and now $1,400. In other countries like Canada, people are getting those amounts every month. There were real needs that people had, and no one was on the streets protesting for those things. Instead, they were protesting for something that, in fact, no one really wants. But we had to pretend that that's what people want.
Thank you for saying all that. And we have about 5 minutes left, or 6 or 7 minutes left, and there's something I've wanted to mention to you ever since I first learned about your excellent book. Again, the book is Cancel This Book, The Progressive Craze Against Cancel Culture. Anyway, when I was in college, one of the speakers who came to our university was Edward Teller. And do you know who Edward Teller was?
I don't think so.
Father of the H-bomb.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, he was in many ways nuts. I mean, he was sort of the basis for Dr. Strangelove. At one point, he wanted to put improve ports in Alaska by setting off H-bombs. And the point is that in my freshman humanities course, we were required to attend his talk, and then the only day of that entire year-long course that I remember is the day after he was there, the intense discussions we had in class. It wasn't that people said, no, don't go see him, and if you do see him, then you need to go to a room where there'll be pictures of puppies and plush toys you can play with. But instead, they sent us to the talk and said, you are going to discuss him tomorrow, and you better be able, if you say he's horrible, you need to be able to support that position. And we had a wonderful discussion in class about it. And it seems to me that that's the point of all this, is if you don't like somebody's book, you write a better book.
Exactly. Right. You don't call for their publisher to stop publishing them, or for them to be deplatformed and not being allowed to speak at a venue, at a bookstore or a university. And again, that was not something that was done when I was in school. In fact, as I mentioned, one thing we did was protest CIA recruitment on campus, and we sat in the president's office for 3 days to protest this. And what we settled for as a compromise with the university, instead of stopping CIA recruitment, we weren't able to get that. But what we settled for was that the university would sponsor at their cost a speakers forum on the CIA, and they would bring in 3 people of our choosing who would speak against the CIA, and 3 that they would choose in favor of the CIA. And every speaker that came, including Phil Agee, the ex-CIA guy who was great, who talked against the CIA, had a huge crowd. This was huge, because of our protests. People were interested in it. So hundreds of people went to every single of these speeches. And we felt really that we had done something, that this was good. To even get people to think about it is good. And again, we didn't try to stop the other 3 people from speaking or coming. We asked them tough questions when we had a chance. But yeah, as you say, that sort of rigorous debate is not supported anymore.
So before we go, I need to go the other direction, and something I've really wanted to raise is that we hear from the left often. I see articles like this all the time that cancel culture doesn't exist. It's made up by the right-wingers, which, by the way, I've been canceled. I've lost multiple publishers. I've been deplatformed a bunch of times by the left. And I'm, old school lefty. Anyway, so A, they claim it doesn't exist, and B, they say even if it did exist, what we're doing is not giving voice to fascists. And so how do you counter that?
Well, I mean, again, to just throw around that term is very dangerous. Are there fascists in the U.S.? Yes. Are there many? No. Are there many that actually do public speaking engagements? No. That term is used way too freely, and it is used against people, again, who simply have a different view of the world than the person claiming they're a fascist. But even so, by the way, again, the ACLU used to defend the right of Nazis to march and fascists to speak, because, the idea is, and it's an idea I largely embrace, is that, in the free marketplace of ideas, it's good for everyone to be able to say what they want. And frankly, that if people are allowed to say what they want, they may be less apt to feel they need to, to speak by shooting people, right? And so, but I think, again, that people are often accused of being fascist when they're not. And again, to just be able to throw that term around and silence someone that way is completely unfair, because, again, many people are told they're fascist when in fact they could not be anything farther from that. And again, it's a way to cut off debate. It's a way to cut off thinking. You just say someone's a fascist and you dismiss them.
And in fact, you can punch them, because you should always punch fascists, they say.
Exactly. And again, what we have is and guess whose benefit? I'll just say, guess whose benefit all of this works to the advantage of? The 1% of the wealthy that control the wealth of this country. They are so happy that people are in the streets fighting each other instead of trying to find common ground and working together to change a horrible and inequitable economic system that we live under.
Well, I want to go back to something you said really early on about how some of the left has lost a lot of its respect for the working class, and of course I have to make this caveat, I don't like Trump, okay, having done the obligatory commentary. Now I can say I found it horrifying that the left called the Trump supporters deplorables. At one point, the left would have called them the working class or blue collar, and we would have attempted to approach them on social issues or on economic issues, as opposed to, deplorables is one step above or below fascist. I don't know which.
No, I agree. That was the worst thing the left has ever done in my recollection. I mean, essentially just to write off anyone who supported Trump, and what, almost 75 million people voted for Trump in 2020. That's a lot of people. And by the way, I think 18 million of those were people of color. To write those people off and to refuse to try to look at their point of view of why they're voting the way they are, again, makes social change impossible, because you need some of those people to make the change that we need in this country. And a lot of those people, while, we could say they were misguided, at least felt Trump listened to them somehow.
Well, there's lots of ways that, I mean, the quote deplorables, end quote, that I know personally know they're getting screwed by transnational corporations. They know that when Walmart comes into town, the small businesses get driven out. They know that corporations control everything. So they have those truths that we could work from, to work toward. We don't agree with them on every issue. In fact, we probably disagree with them on many, many issues. But there are certainly areas like the ascendancy of transnational corporations where we'll be quite in line.
Absolutely. And again, 67% of the American people support Medicare for all. Majority of the people in the country support police reform and criminal justice reform. Most people actually think very progressively. Now, again, there are reasons why they vote for one party or another, but a lot of anger of the working class for the Democratic Party comes from the fact that the Democratic Party has claimed to represent them, but abandoned them years ago. And again, if people do not face that reality, we will not be able to build a more just society.
So this has been I've really enjoyed this. And we're running out of time. I have two questions. They're too big, sorry, but please answer them quickly. One of them is, so what do we do? And the second is, can you tell people more about how they can learn about your fabulous new book and about your fabulous work in general?
Yeah, well, thank you, Derrick. I've enjoyed this as well. What I would say people should do, first of all, is people who do consider themselves progressive people should be very reluctant to try to cancel other people. And they should realize that, kind of mobbing people on social media is not true activism. And certainly when people are well-intentioned and consider themselves your comrade and friend, when they err or when we perceive they err, we should approach them with understanding and compassion. And if we feel that, they did truly err, we can try to convince them in a rational way, to change their mind and to change their actions. We shouldn't go around uniting with the employer class to get those people fired, by and large. And we need to start listening to the voices of people who work for a living, who deliver our food, who work at the grocery stores, who make the things we own, who make the food we eat, and not look down on those people. That would be my key message. In terms of where people can find me, they can go to my publisher. I have a page on my publisher's website, skyhorsepublishing.com. I'm on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik. And I write now largely for RT News. And you can find my articles there.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all of your work in the world, and thank you for being on the program. I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Dan Kovalik. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.